Welcome, everybody. My name is Matt Pearsall. I'm the community manager here in the SEL and education community, and I am very excited to be able to join you all again with the latest in our SEL in Education speaker series. And we're going to be welcoming back Jordan Posamentier, the Director of Policy and Advocacy from Committee for Children, to talk a little bit more about kind of the intersection of social emotional learning and anti-racist and anti-bias education. So welcome, Jordan. It's February, still for a little bit, which means it's Black History Month here in the United States. And so it seems fitting that we discuss the relationship between Black studies, anti-racist curricula, and social emotional learning. So I want to start off the conversation by talking about Black studies. In your social emotional learning and racial equity brief, you discuss how Black studies and social emotional learning relate to one another. Can you say a little bit more about that? And for everybody watching at home, I'm gonna post in the comments here the link to the brief so you can read it as well.
Right on, Matt. Thanks for having me again. And yeah, let me just start by recognizing we're just a couple of white-skinned dudes talking about Black studies. That might seem noticeable to a lot of our audience and participants today. On account of that observation, let me start by talking about the why. Why will this help our audiences? Will help our audiences appreciate this crosswalk between social emotional learning and these other topical areas, Black studies and anti-racist curricula. To the observation that we're just a couple white-skinned guys, every kid benefits from curricula that serve as a window into the lives of others and mirrors wherein they see themselves reflected back. So mirrors and windows benefit all kids, my kids, others' kids, irrespective of their backgrounds. This is especially true with respect to mirrors as applied to Black kids who are often underrepresented in curricula and who are highly overexposed to negative Black stereotypes. So including Black studies in schools helps push back against that adversity.
So is that why it helps Black studies? It helps to include Black studies in school, but what do we mean by Black studies exactly? What is included in that?
Yeah, so in the policy space, this starts to matter in particular, all the way down to the practitioner level. We have to understand what we're saying when we say Black studies. It usually falls under this broad umbrella of multicultural education, which has been around now for decades. It often doesn't get named that. Nowadays, what we tend to see is Black studies encompassed within ethnic studies. Ethnic studies highlight perspectives, information from marginalized experiences and scholarship. So kids who have access to what we call Black studies, they might learn about Black inventors and scientists, Black authors and artists, Black political leaders and scholars. Now, I should add that it being Black History Month, schools tend to offer, in particular this month, more to ensure, perhaps with greater intensity, that there is some focus on Black studies. But I should say there is caution in the field about making Black studies its own thing. In particular, there was a brief maybe half a year ago from Education Trust. It calls out this risk. It says, while focusing on Black studies ensures the subject matter gets attention, it might reinforce othering against Blackness, which risks perpetuating divides we'd rather see diminished. So if I had to guess, and this is just a guess, I'd say weaving Black studies and other ethnic studies intentionally into social studies or history curricula, that might be the better way to go over time. But I don't know of the empirical research that speaks to this strongly one way or the other. So at this point, I'd say it's just important to be cognizant of the issues.
So how does social emotional learning connect with Black studies?
All right, let's start doing the crosswalk. Yeah, so social emotional learning complements Black and ethnic studies by contributing to self and social awareness. Those are two components that Castle names as primary for social emotional learning. If you're not Black, or if you don't get to spend a lot of time in Black community, then Black studies offers a chance to skill build in social awareness. Those are the windows to come to appreciate the variation of experience, particularly in the United States, that we have across community, race, culture. If you are Black, then Black studies can offer a chance to skill build around self-awareness, knowing history and contemporary action you're distinctly connected to, how that might shape who you are or wish to be. It helps build self-efficacy and a sense of worth and it helps these studies, the studies are showing that it yields a positive impact on student engagement, especially, says the research, where students of color read literature by authors who share their ethnic background. More immediately, perhaps Black studies together with SEL can be a part of a comprehensive effort to promote safe and welcoming learning environments for all students.
So in the brief that you wrote on SEL and racial equity, you also talk about SEL and anti-racism. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between anti-racism and Black studies, and can just help parse that for us?
Yeah, there's a reason we want to talk about these things together. Remember how I was saying that Black studies could reinforce otherness when it's distinguished and separated out from other subject areas? Well, that's a reason why it's beneficial to include anti-racism curricula when advancing Black studies. Anti-racism means a lot of things to a lot of people. It's a term that's often used in politics as well as in the classroom. So let's just clarify for the sake of this conversation. In schools, it tends to be about bringing awareness to racial prejudice and history and current events associated with such prejudice, and promoting respect for and value of differences, which many social emotional learning programs are working on anyway, just not necessarily in a racialized context. So that's probably why research, I've seen at least, says you'll get better outcomes, changes in attitudes and behaviors around race, if you pair anti-racism and Black studies together. Anti-racism has a role to play in there in particular. It helps kids become aware of the harms of racism, and this is important, helps them see what steps can be taken to eliminate those harms, that they can play to help eliminate those harms, or at least to slow or stop the harms from continuing. So at its best, anti-racism helps kids see their personal role in fostering racial harmony. And we know from what Castle's been producing more recently, there's a real increased focus on student agency, and this speaks directly to the power of student agency.
Can you talk a little bit more about the connection between anti-racism and social emotional learning?
Yeah, let's spell this out a little bit. So social emotional learning can serve to promote anti-racist education, efforts by fostering social awareness and problem-solving competencies. It has this knock-on effect, this amplifying effect, this complementary effect with Black studies. And here's the thing worth mentioning. Anti-racism can help social emotional learning avoid some pitfalls that could further perpetuate racial inequity or adversity. For example, some schools might be tempted, and I've heard about this anecdotally, they might be tempted to use social emotional learning strictly as a disciplinary tool, or just as a part of a disciplinary structure. They'll say, if a kid is exhibiting unwanted behavior in the classroom, they can go to the social emotional learning timeout room. And this even happens in virtual environments, the timeout room where they're meant to get corrected, so to speak. Well, this makes social emotional learning punitive, makes it a punishment. And we talked about this in an earlier conversation you and I did, which I'm sure is available on the site. Because Black kids are more likely to experience exclusionary discipline, the risk here is that social emotional learning just becomes one more tool that's punitive against the Black population. Now, sometimes this gets referred to as the weaponization of SEL, and anyone creating SEL initiatives, programs, efforts in the classroom needs to be particularly cognizant of this, and anti-racist work can help the field avoid those pitfalls and get it right without making SEL become a weapon. So as you know, let me just follow that by saying with social emotional learning and Black studies, they can both together help kids make for safer and welcoming learning environments. But adding anti-racism into the mix, adding that curricula into the equation can deepen those efforts by fostering a sense of youth personal empowerment in the culture. It all helps the kids come to school and say, I can be part of making this world more just and equitable.
Which is really neat. I mean, I think that's really a place we want to get to in general. I mean, for all the different work we're doing to try to make a safer, more peaceful world for kids. I think this all makes a lot of sense to me, kind of at a practical level. But I think one of the really neat things I appreciate about when you come and speak with us is that you're able to talk about this from a policy and advocacy point of view. What is the from your perch as director of policy and advocacy at Committee for Children, what is the scoop in the policy space as far as Black studies and anti-racism are concerned?
Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about what's happening across the field. There's plenty of action in the state legislatures. I'll start though by suggesting there's a really helpful recent Education Next article out talking about the California experience of developing an ethnic studies curricula. It'd be great if you could share that, because I think it really lays out some of the challenges, some of the sort of trial and error approach that state has taken to figure out how to get this right. And they, when they're finished, might serve as an exemplar for other states who are trying to get there. But I will tell you, as a paranoid attorney, I'm worried about a couple of things policy-wise. Particularly, I'm worried state legislatures, very well-intended and eager to advance anti-racist curriculum in Black studies, are probably going to do it without much care to how they are meant to connect with one another. And I'm a little worried they're not going to put a lot of care into how social emotional learning might play a role to make these endeavors successful. But worries aside, it's happening pretty assertively across the country, and I'll give you a few examples. Washington State recently passed legislation to make ethnic studies materials available to public schools, encouraged K through 6 public schools to incorporate them. Virginia recently passed legislation for culturally relevant and inclusive education, a committee to create recommendations on anti-biased education and professional development. Arizona just introduced, hasn't passed, they've introduced legislation to create a model ethnic studies curriculum. Louisiana passed a resolution asking the state board to study anti-racist education, maybe create a task force to develop recommendations. Minnesota also introduced for culturally relevant and ethnic studies curricula using culturally responsive methodologies. What's interesting about theirs is that they further direct the commissioner in the state to develop and adopt state SEL standards for social, emotional, and cognitive development. So that's an interesting combination of the set of policies that we've been talking about. A bunch of other states have already passed variations of ethnic studies, Black studies, aspects of anti-racism education. Okay, let me tell you what else I'm worried about. Eager schools and systems. They are anxious to get this right. I'm worried they're going to sub social emotional learning into spaces where anti-racism or Black studies really belong. As much as there's overlap between these two provinces, historically they've drawn on different research, expertise, experts, thinking, practice. Social emotional learning shouldn't be expected to serve as school's anti-racist curriculum any more than like a math curriculum is meant to be a school science curriculum. We have to, of course they relate, but they're distinct. I think it's really prudent and respectful to honor that distinction, especially if you want to see the outcomes we're seeking in the classroom to take root. So, okay, just backing up, given it in a nutshell, I think there's a lot of room for the practitioner at the practitioner level to do this really well or to do this really terribly. It's a big concern, but I suppose that's true of any major new aspirational project in education. We very much are dependent upon the great educators in our classrooms to get this right. And unless we help educators feel confident and competent to tackle the task, we're at risk of chasing windmills. So I think it's best upon us to figure out how do we help our educators get there?
So how can all the folk that are listening here, how can they get involved? I think that's one of the neat things about thinking about this from a policy perspective is that people could maybe do stuff to help.
Absolutely. Well, there's many resources beyond Committee for Children's. I will recommend that if you're curious about that SEL and racial equity crosswalk, to check out the brief that Matt shared out. We've been doing a lot to try to weave equity-related policy into our legislative advocacy for several years now. It's very hard to go over the entire list because what we end up doing is seeing, say, an SEL bill and find ways to incorporate better equity levers into that, or we find a giant bill that has nothing to do with either, and we chisel little lines into page 152 of an otherwise enormous piece of legislation. So it's hard to call it out. But what you've heard today is part of that, and you can sign up and get some customizable action alerts from us at key times. So when your state is doing something, when the federal government's doing something, you can hear from my team, my policy and advocacy team, to give you an opportunity to lift your voice up, to tell your story about why all these things matter and matter together. so that we can help advance that and join together in the shared mission.
Well, thank you very much for coming and talking about this with us, Jordan. I think it's this is a difficult topic to kind of wrap up and talk about in such a short amount of time as we have here. But I appreciate you coming in and kind of distilling these down for us and helping us to track on these really important connections, because this is I feel like a social emotional learning is headed is headed in the direction of being very much intertwined and supporting equity in education, and I appreciate your helping us to sort of kind of track and see where things are headed in the future.
Yes, sir. Well, it's been my privilege and my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me along the series of conversations that we've held.
Oh, and if you all want to continue the conversation, if you're watching this in the SEL education community, then you're already there. But if you're not watching and you're watching it somewhere else, please join us in the SEL and education community, where we can continue conversations like these, as well as conversations about all sorts of different things having to do with social emotional learning. It's a great space, a lot of great educators from around the world coming together to share expertise and support each other in this important work. So I hope to see you all later in the SEL education community. And until then, thank you very much, and you all have an excellent day.